Hello and welcome to today's video where I focused on the new BBC series Chess Masters Endgame. It airs every Monday and we've just had this week episode 3, which featured a cameo by none other than Magnus Carlsen, the former world champion after he abdicated the throne in 2022, and the current world number 1, he's still that good. And he gave the challenge of this position we see on the screen in front of you, and the contestants had 60 seconds to memorize all the pieces and then were given a blank board, and this position was taken away and they had to remember where all the pieces were. Well, first things first, here's my attempt, and we see here that I of course made a narrative with the pawns, got the rook on the right square. The bishops are pretty powerful, so I remembered that much, and I mostly remembered the king-queen side even as well, where the black king is. But I got in a bit of a pickle over these pieces on the A file. There was a bit of a traffic jam here, and as a result they were in fact back here and here. The bishop on the light squares and the pawn back on A3 attacking the knight. So whatever the percentage is in the 90s, I wasn't unhappy with that, and it's good fun following along with the challenges to see if you can do it. And that's one thing I would say I've noticed, is that the challenges they've been given, throughout all the episodes thus far, have been relatively nuanced. There's been some actual chess playing, but for example there was, can you put all queens on the board without any of them attacking each other? And of course the theme was to put them a knight square away. That was quite a nice challenge to see, moving away from the traditional playing element of chess. It makes it fun, it's nuanced, not everyone knows it. I certainly struggled with that task. And on top of that, they had this task as well, which was more a memory test than the act of playing. Just a different skill set, so that's been definitely very good to watch. I will say the nicknames they've been given feel a bit contrived. You know, Swashbuckler and Smiling Assassin amongst all the others, not zeroing on them themselves. You know, that they've been very entertaining to watch, the contestants, but the idea of these nicknames definitely feels like it's just needless dramatization, sort of going off away from the chess, and indeed that's what we're going to look at today, where Carlsen didn't name the game or his opponent, but having delved into the archive, I've found that it is a game from 2022, as we see here, between himself, Magnus Carlsen as white, and Richard Rapport, Qh7's second in the previous World Championship cycle, in the match in 2024. And he is of course a very strong player. You can see from their ratings on the screen that Rapport is 2740, Carlsen at the time was 2860, so both very strong players. And if, like me, you were looking at this position thinking, what the hell is going on, you'd be correct. Black's king is firmly sidelined, not exactly in a happy place, and had it gone back earlier to the back rank, then there's firstly illegalities there, but also issues on A8. So A6 was almost certainly the right choice, but it has its fair share of problems. The rook could come to A1, for example. That all being said, black is a rook up for simply 2 pawns. Let's say, for example, A takes B4, which is the best move. This opens the A file for the aforementioned rook on the A file there. But after example, knight takes C3, the A file is very likely plugged for the moment. There's even B5 to support the bishop, although that would trap it a little bit, though it's likely to bounce out again. But most importantly, the king then has a bit of breathing room, and because of black's very active queen and the rooks on the back rank, a bit of triangulation almost here, defending everything, it makes it very hard for this queen to do anything towards that black king if it were to go to B5. For that reason, black should just about be safe and therefore is at least better at this point. And before we continue analysing what happened hereafter, it's good to go back to the very beginning, where Carlsen opened with D4. And after E6, well, Rapport is essentially tempting Carlsen to play E4 and go into mainline French positions, and sort of having gone D4, hoping for Carlsen at this point especially was playing the Catalan a fair bit, the London system, and so on. There could have been various, you know, if for example D5, bishop F4 could have been seen, C4 could have been seen, and so on. But instead, Rapport playing E6 clearly is sort of goading Carlsen to go into a completely different opening. At that level, of course, it's a bit of almost a formality, a bit of a joke between very strong players, but the point is it's sort of going in a different direction than perhaps Carlsen had intended. And after D5, knight C3 reached the sort of crossroads moment where black can play knight f6 and go into what we saw in the Ding Gukesh World Championship match, where the Steinitz variation appeared on the board a fair bit, and there's knight ce2, and from this plethora of arrows here you see various attempts by black on the queen side. Meanwhile in green and yellow for the knight, here, 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 and here, you see a lot of pressure that can be placed on the black queen side. So that would typically be, that's what we saw in fact in the Dingukesh World Championship match. But instead, Rapport played bishop to b4, pinning the knight on c3, placing indirect pressure on e4, basically compelling the main line of e5. Makes sense, it locks it up, stops the point, and stops knight to f6, so, you know, you had your chance, black says white, but you're not able to do it now, and this knight has to come out elsewhere. Of course, it has other routes. It's not saying that this is actively a bad route, it's just different and sort of morphing the structure. Black, trying to open up the center, plays c5, sort of claiming that because white has put the pawn in the green rectangle here, in yellow, into black's half of the board, perhaps they can start striking back. So after a3, black is compelled to capture. And that is because if they dare retreat, feel free to pause the video to see what you would play. And, well done if you found the move. It is b4 immediately. And that's because if captures, this is the critical point, knight to b5, firstly, threatens knight to d6 check. It does allow a relatively scary looking pawn takes a3 check discovered. But after c3, because of this subsequent threat, and you know the queen can easily come and defend c3 if need be, meanwhile the bishop's jumping into a3 and everything's very, very bad for black. You almost get a Benko-esque structure where after bishop takes a3, placing pressure down this diagonal, preventing the king from castling for the foreseeable future, and getting the knight into d6, and having all the perks of this queenside pressure, as in the Benko Gambit, it's just borderline winning for white. For that reason, after a3 back here, black is compelled to capture. It doubles the pawns, locks the center a fair bit, but white does get to the bishop pair, and as we saw just then, if the bishop could get to a3, there'd be a lot of issues on the dark squares. There followed queen c7 and h4. Locking up the center. Now, it's worth saying, if black tries to, for example, capture, trying to say take with the queen to defend your pawns, but of course then knight c6 would be very problematic and the pawn structure would be terrible. Pawn takes is the repercussion of this, because if the queen tries to check on c3, it does seem to do some nasty business. There is bishop d2 preventing the loss of the rook, and this is the point. After queen takes d4, the winning of the pawn is short-lived because white gets immediate traction, and even if the check comes through after bishop to here, let's just say knight to e7 to develop, then bishop to d3, queen to g4. Already white has got a huge development advantage, and this queen will only be bullied around even more. Even if the queen goes to a4, well, then there'll be various bishop b5 with the help of knight to d4, threatening even to b5 itself, and then to d6. The queen's just being attacked, and white's fully developed, black simply is not. And if they dare, after let's say rook h3, try to take the pawn, it's simply too much. Rook to g3, queen to h1, bishop f1, and now rook will be trapping the queen. Just one sample variation. The queen doesn't have to take the second pawn, but it just shows how the development really will pay dividends for white. Back to the reality. After h4, they do not do that because of what we just saw, and knight e7 is typically essayed, and after h5, white would love to place pressure on the black king side and weaken the dark squares in yellow, so h6 is played, like so, and white develops the knight to f3, and this simply develops and defends, stops any of the pawn gambits that we just saw. They worked for white regardless, but the point is these moves were stopping it from working in the first place. b6, hoping to play bishop to a6, and of course if black can trade off one of the bishop pair, perhaps leave these pawns, making this bishop a bad bishop, then that would be very logical, which is why Carlsen played bishop to b5 check, with the aim of saying, well, you either move your king, which obviously isn't good, stuck in the center or on the f8 square and stranding the rook here. You move the knight to block, which of course precludes bishop a6, or you put the bishop, as happened, on d7, and then bishop back to d3, a sort of Schwissensick claiming, made you move your bishop to this d7 square. Again, it's not that it's necessarily worse than a6, as we'll see this bishop, and you may remember from the TV position, the bishop does get to a4 and place pressure here, but it does mean that white is preventing black from their simple plan, which would potentially slow down the obvious attack here. And indeed, this prevents any knight f5 nonsense, because often you can just capture double the pawn and have a very good knight versus bishop position. With that being said, c4 by black, another move that locks down this structure, the center here, leaving these pawns blocking the bishop. But in doing that, there's no pressure on the d4 square, so it's a very committal move by black, but they're wagering that they can also look to get some counterplay in the long run, both by the green pawn breaks and potentially this knight hopping around in to the queen side. So with all of that's a long process, of course, and by that time white will be maneuvering and getting pressure, etc, etc. With that being said, bishop a4 was played to maneuver first and then start to strike. They're getting their bishop to there, just tethering the queen to the defense. Bishop to f4, sensible developing move, pretty obvious implications. Knight to a6, queen to d2, just developing. Now at this point, castling kingside would be just completely lost almost. There's even immediate sacrifices that seem to almost work. But more importantly, if they were to, for example, castle kingside, even rook h3 to here, bishop sacrifices, everything works for white. There's just no defense. This knight on f5 will not really do too much. And there's g4, g5, playing it slowly would work as well. For that reason, they castle queenside, of course. Rapport very aware kingside is not where it's meant to be. And having locked this up, the benefit, of course, is the king is more potentially able to just hide out on the queenside. There's only one open b file, and it's not like there's a pawn break possible. You know, these pawns are not able to shift the structure, whereas black is the one able in green to push up to b4. As long as black doesn't do that, perhaps the king can hide out here. Problem is, there's a lot of pressure on the center, and as you remember from the TV position once more, that will erupt forwards. Knight to h2, repositioning, king to b7, just getting it a little bit better placed, opening the back rank. Often the king belongs in the corner essentially, and of course b8 would have obvious issues. For example, this knight would be coming to f6 if that king was also on b8. Perhaps it wouldn't be doing too much on f6, but the point is it would become a new resource possible. Knight to f1, Carlsen at a very specific point for this knight. Of course, it's jumped back around like so to place pressure on the pawns and try to use the fact that the two bishops are going to be very, very powerful. Knight to c7, sort of over defending the pawn on d5, and king to f1. Carlsen's point is he wants to place the king either on h2 or play g3 and place it on g2. And at this point, well, Rapport played knight to c6. Had he played g5, this would have been very interesting, because white now, after captures en passant, cannot actually fully win this h6 pawn. Because of this pin, black can actually play knight to g8, and although white has won a pawn, as we see here from everything, white is stretched quite thin. The bishop can never move, essentially. The queen could come to h7 as well. The bishop can also just start nobbling on this pawn, and the queen can't. It's overloaded, it cannot defend both. For all of those reasons, winning the pawn, but then sort of opening it for black's pieces. Even though this knight's gone back to its home square, it's placing pressure. It has a huge good purpose. And for all of those reasons, this would not be very good for white to win the pawn. If you can't win the pawn, then after en passant, then of course this has opened lines up, etc, etc. Essentially, as we will see in a moment, white is not quite ready to deal with g5. Fortunately for Magnus, knight c6 was played, and after g3, queen e8, king g2. After, for example, queen to g8, rook to b1. Now the same pawn move, trying to open things up, winning the bishop, it seems, can be met by this, and now bishop can take, simply because, unlike in the previous scenario, this is defended. Now white can win the pawn and have all the perks of the space behind it. They can simply put the bishop on the outpost, they can put a knight on the outpost, and it's a pawn down for black and all the additional issues of losing control of the space. Unlike in the previous scenario, white can do this because they're a bit more combobulated and able to control squares. Without further ado, we'll go back to where we were. So at this point, after rook a to b1, queen h7 was played, sort of seeing, well, now I need to get ready. Of course, placing pressure cagely on this pawn. And we're nearing the game TV position, where after king to b8, avoiding the obvious diagonal down, queen to e2, sort of starting to, as we can see from all these arrows, place pressure on the c4 pawn, place pressure down here, and there's definite sacrifices in the air. And that's why, after rook to c8, sort of saying, watch out if you dare take with your knight and queen on c4, this rook will, of course, cause issues to that. Carlsen just played rook to b2. And after knight to b5, there's a bit of a crossroads. Black has positioned everything. They clearly dominate the queen side, and Carlsen needs to change that. If they play defensively, perhaps they can't take immediately because of queen a1 pinning, but ultimately white is purely defensive, and black will now reroute the queen. If white's rerouting the queen, so can black. Start pressurizing this. Black's having all the fun, and white's purely defensive with very little counterplay against this, possibly due to g3 just locking out from the rook. And so at this point, Carlsen instead, after knight to b5, as we see here, decided to go for broke and exploded open the position with knight takes d5. Very good move. It defends briefly, so there's no issues here. Of course, black has to capture. If not, white has all the perks and has a knight jumping in, so pretty much insta capture there. And now Carlsen tried e6, which makes a lot of sense. It's gaining a check. Looks like you're perhaps taking the pawn on d5. However, the computer's suggestion is actually rook takes b5, sacrificing the exchange, specifically because it's very much a minor pieces, especially knight's game, and this removes the powerful knight that is eyeing up all these pawns, which would just, if that knight ever got to e4, it would be very, very problematic and just block all of the play for white. And so capturing it, although it sacrifices the exchange, after bishop takes d5, because this pawn remains here and so queen f5 does not attack the bishop, and on top of that, this remains a threat. The threat is better than the execution of the attack. All of a sudden, although we reach a similar position as in the TV position where white is an entire rook down, they, 8 pawns v6 for white versus black, but of course 2 rooks. But they do have sort of a cascade in the center with 2 bishops, very, very powerful. The queen's offside, and even if it comes to this square, there's moves like a4, kicking the bishop away, or if it captures, opening the file, and of course queen takes c4 then becomes a possibility. So with this queen so far out of the way and unable to gain any traction, even if it does come to f5 immediately, there's a lot of practical problems for black to deal with, and well, it would have been a potentially better version of what we see. Instead, e6 check. I think the main difference being that after king moves and pawn takes, queen f5 at this point, which is what Rapport's played, defends d5 and means that we don't get quite as much access to the king's position. And of course, Carlsen is a rook down, playing with fire here. Rook to b4 was played, insisting to sacrifice the exchange. There is possibilities of this, but then queen perhaps moves to d2 and starts attacking the knight, even e1, so that the knight can't jump to e4 with a tempo gain. And then, of course, this knight is forced to babysit the bishop, so that would have been a bit of a needless winning of a pawn when it would have forced black into the defensive. So instead, knight takes b4, queen e7 check, king a6, and this is, of course, the TV'd position where Carlsen actually captured with the queen. Now, of course, as I mentioned earlier, a takes was very likely best, and well, the computer gives this reliably at around -1 for black, which, given black is an entire rook up, makes it even more confusing. Because the rooks are not quite well suited. The pawn in yellow covers these, the bishops have more access, and of course the king is in a bit of a pickle, to say the least, with the rook on a1. Queen takes b4, very good try nonetheless, placing pressure, very logical, very human move. And after bishop takes c2, threatening to bounce back around, a4 was played, continuing with an attack against the black king. Now here perhaps Rapport should have played knight takes c3, with the reasoning being that this reduces the queen, it can't come here without capturing the knight as well, and so the queen's drawn away from the king, and you are so much material up, often returning a little bit is a very useful mechanism in positions. And after, for example, bishop to e4, we can see that the bishop pair are being traded off. There's no pressure here, and so the king will sit reasonably happily on b7, and that could well be all she wrote. Just a clear exchange down, for example. Bishop takes, even d takes is possible, eyeing this up, keeping the pawn here, and even trading the queens, giving back a pawn, but of course an exchange up will be a trivial win with a passed pawn to boot as well. But instead, after a4, Rapport decided to play knight c7, defending d5, but there followed a bishop takes c7, and because of queen to b5 check, capturing possibly is a little bit risky and, well, could give white some relatively straightforward attack. Perhaps it's ultimately objectively fine, but I can see why Rapport perhaps felt instead he played bishop to e4, sort of saying, well, you've captured me, but I'm not going to play the automatic move. I'm going to threaten, well, an obvious check or worse. But Carlsen called Rapport's bluff and played bishop back to f4, and after bishop takes f3, king takes queen e4. Well, Carlsen does, after the forced king g4, lose the rook in the corner, and so for now is quite literally bishop and 2 pawns versus, or in fact at this point, bishop and 1 pawn versus 2 rooks. But of course, as I've already said, this bishop is able to control a lot of important squares. This queen able to control a lot as well, including the queening square. And then this king is, of course, not very safe. And this pawn coming up, combined with the queen check, well, white's pieces perhaps mesh well with the pawn structure, black's pieces perhaps less so. And meanwhile, let's see what happened. Queen to b5 check, king b7, and a5, continuing this attack. Of course, if we can achieve as white a6 with queen d5 check coming in, that's a mating net. So very logical, and there's nothing really black can do. So although the material imbalance, well, two things are happening. Firstly, the rooks are not particularly well suited to defending just the pawns and beating essentially the bishop and the queen and their diagonal capabilities around the pawns. And secondly, the sheer act of capturing on h1 has perhaps offsided the queen a little bit. There's only one check, which will be met with f3, and then there's no further checks. The king's relatively safe, as Carlsen has said himself. The king that's safest is often the one with more pawns around it, and of course here, white is the only one with more pawns about it. There's only 2 over here, and there's a lot of pressure being placed on them. For that reason, rook hd8 was played. Now here, after a6, king a8, Carlsen chose to queen the pawn. Now, that is the second move in the sequence, because f3, despite the material imbalance, is now completely winning for white, because this queen is powerless to help the critical defense of d5. And let's just say, for the sake of argument, queen to a1 is played, then f8 equals queen, and the rook is overloaded. There's nothing that it can do, and there's nothing it could have done to prevent this. Of course, if captures, then queen to d5, and there's only one final move to delay the mate, and we see the checkmate. And it would be mate on b7, even if the king could go to b8, it's worth noting. And if we go back to the point where the pawn queened, or indeed before, well, at this point, the rook can't move up. This is why the bishop and queen, they have a lot of play, a lot of power in the position, and the rooks are sort of sitting here, pinioned to the defense of the back rank, and they're struggling to defend everything whilst the queen's gone on a walkabout. Now, f8 queen changed that, because after rook takes, the queen is still defending, and so queen to d7, a very useful point threatening checkmate, but there followed, thanks to the additional rook placement on f8, a check. Now, of course, if king takes the rook, then feel free to pause the video and see if you can find the best move, but it is check your checks. Queen to e4 mate. The 2 squares in yellow are covered by the pawn and the illegal move of king takes g3, and then the queen covers all the remaining squares. Outposts are very, very powerful. Now, for that reason, g takes was forced, not the king. But this, of course, now opens up. Suddenly, this queen can do, as you'd expect, a bunch of different checks. And so after queen to g2 check, king h4, well, Carlsen would have had to be okay with a 3-fold repetition. Of course, he is a rook down. He was very much playing on instinct in this blitz game. But Rapport wanted more. He wanted to just torture and win some pawns. And so g5 check here. If the pawn takes, then the pawn takes back with a lovely pawn mate, because the pawn on h5 remains. For that reason, en passant is forced at this point, the only move that doesn't lead to immediate mate. But that, of course, allows queen to a check, h5, and suddenly we're setting up for, if this queen could get to g4, the queens come off, and you would think this would lead to a trivial win, being a rook up, covering the back rank, and obvious pawn majorities themselves. However, let's see how this went. Because at this point, well, if the queen is able to come and start bouncing back around and defending this checkmate, then, for example, queen to f4, queen to c7, then black is trivially winning. There's always queen to c6, even against the queen check. And once a position like that, for example, if king to f1, queen to f4, this would be, by way of an example, a complete win for black. There's no way this is surviving for white. This rook will always be able to come round if the queen's trade off, and there's this passed pawn, and then now this rook is also coming in for checks, and once the checks start with both major pieces, it's game over. For that reason, queen h4 basically compels white to step up. If, for example, king to e3 at this point, then the same sort of checks start to happen with the threat of check and or check, queen back to c7 happening, and so Carlsen played king to f3, but this of course allowed queen g4, but it leaves some ambiguity. Now computers scream at this position that it's totally winning, I think mate in 25 here, because they see that the pawns for white will not win the day. But here follows essentially a bit of a pawn race. The pawns march, and miraculously both sides retrieve their queens, as we see here. And once again, we're in a very Richard Rapport-esque position where, despite being a rook up, for black, Rapport in this case, the result perhaps is a little bit in doubt. You know, this pawn queening would firstly get a second queen, which is scary enough, threaten mate, and such and such. So that's very tricky to sort of stomach. But the winning plan revolves around firstly allowing the pawn to queen, but just being in a position to capture it, and relying and seeing the fact that this pawn will become a queen in the resultant trade-offs. And so queen to g1 is the move Rapport played here. And essentially the winning plan revolves around getting this queen to the e6 square to cover the queen square, to cover the rook, and to defend the pawn and the mate threats and so on and so forth. Because as we will see, if, for example, king to h5, queen to h2, king to g6, well, at this point, queen g3 essentially forces this king to move this way or this way, and in the case of king f7, this queen can simply trade itself off, and we see a winning king and pawn endgame with this pawn queening on c1. And if king h6 instead, and this is where queen e6 comes in, queen to check, king to here, queen to e6 check, and after this, black can simply push the pawn. If this ever queens, then it's a trivial win, with the pawn queening once again. And if there's nothing else white can do, that would be all she wrote. So that's a very hard plan to see, and indeed, Rapport's having to find this almost only mechanism in the position under intense time pressure, started playing some checks away from that, and after c3 allowed this queen to come out, and suddenly this queen cannot come to e6. White has mobilized, is threatening some kind of a mate, which is very scary. Queen h4 check, king g6, queen e4 check. Again, a threefold is almost certain if black wanted it, but of course being a rook up they wanted more. And after king to g5, queen e3 check, suddenly king h5, and there's no way to coordinate. In fact, the best line at this point is to simply continue checking. But Rapport's not quite seeing the change in the tide, played queen to e8, a complete mistake, because now g8 equals queen, and the point is, although g8 is covered, our eyes are all on the g8 square, and suddenly checkmate on b7 would occur. And suddenly it's Magnus Carlsen who is winning, and indeed went on to win this game. There followed queen to e2 check, but the two queens simply rally around that king, and we see this queen covering all the infiltration squares, this queen breaking in, etc, etc, etc. And after a few more moves, white consolidated, Magnus consolidated. The game ended after queen g8 check, because the mate is certain to follow one way or the other. Nothing to do. A very fascinating game, and perhaps, well, that's why I'm showing it here, perhaps we could have seen more on the Chess Masters show, but nonetheless a very, very interesting memory test that we saw, and this was the whole game that hopefully will contextualize for you what had happened. Do stay tuned for more. I will be doing further reviews of the Chess Masters TV program. But until then, see you next week. Cheers!